You may have heard of white women for Kamala, black women for Kamala, white dudes for Harris, Haley voters for Harris, or even cat ladies for Harris. But have you heard of evangelicals for Harris? It's a real thing, and it's causing quite a stir. Part of the reason for the internet uproar is that the group used footage of the late Reverend Billy Graham in an ad supporting Harris. For context, Graham was hailed as, quote, America's pastor, and the pastor to presidents, working with leaders like Harry Truman, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter. Here's a look at what that ad featured.
And said, Lord, I have sinned. I'm sorry for my sin. I'm willing to change my way of life.
Have you ever asked God for forgiveness? That's a tough question. I'm not sure I have. I don't bring God into that picture. I don't.
His son, Reverend Franklin Graham, criticized the group for using his father's image and took to Twitter to say, quote, the liberals are using anything and everything they can to promote candidate Harris. They even developed a political ad trying to use my father, Billy Graham's image. They are trying to mislead people. Maybe they don't know that my father appreciated the conservative values and policies of President Donald Trump in 2016. And if he were alive today, my father's views and opinions would not have changed. To which Evangelicals for Harris responded, quote, the issue, Franklin, is that in your worship of Trump, you have forsaken the gospel. We are voting for Harris, but we only worship Jesus. Remember the calling to which you were called. And this is how MSNBC's Joy Reid reacted to the drama. Let's watch.
They're not alone in tiring of his act. A separate group, Christians for Kamala, had a Zoom meeting last night that included leaders from several progressive Christian groups, urging supporters to get behind Harris and Walz. Call it divine intervention? Or perhaps lots of Christians are just getting fed up with being associated with the hateful vision of Donald Trump, his Bible stunts and religious hypocrisy, and are fighting back with a counter-narrative to conservative evangelicals' overwhelming support for Trump. These groups say the conversation on faith and spirituality has been hijacked by the Christian right.
So I'm not an evangelical. I haven't talked to any evangelicals about this. I just said talking. I'm just getting the Billy Graham spirit. So you're on the story. What do you think the evangelical community's position is if they're not in Kamala, Evangelicals for Kamala's faction? Is there another faction? What do they make of Kamala's new group?
Well, I mean, traditionally, evangelicals have voted for Republican candidates because of the social conservatism policies that they support. So this is definitely a break from that. I think it was very dishonest for them to use Billy Graham in that ad to suggest that he would be opposed to Trump and in support of Kamala Harris. As Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, pointed out, one of the last election that he voted in was for Trump in 2016. He did vote for Trump and definitely would not approve of a lot of the social aspects of the Harris ticket. He definitely viewed social conservatism as a really important part of his pastorhood and the work that he was trying to do as a preacher. I thought it was dishonest and weird that they would try to sort of co-opt him for their movement when he definitely would not support probably the vast majority of the policies that he's put in. And I will say also that Billy Graham's granddaughter was on that call. She pre-recorded a message for the members of this Evangelicals for Harris group. And her contention with Trump has always been personal, about personality. And I think that sort of gets away from the fact that most people, contrary to this tweet from the Evangelicals for Harris account that tweeted at Franklin Graham, the evangelicals are not worshiping Trump. They don't think that he's some godly figure, but they recognize him as a potential change agent for conservative policies at the very least, and more commonly that he is the best or most viable alternative to what they see as the cultural excesses of the left. So it's sort of like he's their imperfect messenger. And to reduce it down to, well, if you vote for this guy, then you support all of his, personal failings or personal sins, I think is just not indicative of what our politics is in reality in this country.
Yeah, he might not be a good Christian by their standards of a good Christian, but that's separate from their vote choice. Right? Yeah. I think the thing I hear a lot from people who are Christians is that we're only supposed to worship Jesus, and there are people who are worshiping Donald Trump as if he is some kind of biblical savior. But I don't think that means those people are going to necessarily vote for Kamala Harris, but they might see some of their values as evangelicals as aligned with her campaign in the same way, Christians have seen Trump as aligned with their religious values. And I think the world is filled with many perspectives. It makes sense they come from all over the place. It is very interesting to see this cause a stir where you have Billy Graham's granddaughter making commentary, Franklin Graham also making commentary on this. I think it's interesting what the affinity groups have done to our political process, because there almost is this belief that, well, I'm in that group and I don't support her, so you in this affinity group shouldn't support her. It's caused a weird division, and there's another weird division going on in a slightly different vein that a lot of people are saying this is a psyop, but this argument that's taking place in social media mostly, people making videos and sowing division between the Muslim community and the Black community over whether or not they should support Kamala Harris and what she'll do on Palestine. But I think we're in a much better place when we say, everyone has their vote choice. We're not going to shame people for that, because every issue we have in our society isn't going to be solved in one presidential election.
Yeah, and also people are allowed to have a different perspective on what matters most to them. I so many times in my life have been called a traitor to my gender because I generally vote conservative, and it's like, well, maybe I just value different issues in a different priority order than you do, and I don't understand why that has to be a problem and why we can't all think for ourselves. And I think it's quite reductive and even offensive to suggest that people have to vote a certain way because they're part of a certain identity group. The faith question can be a little bit different because there are things that we're really not supposed to compromise on, at least from a Catholic perspective. I obviously don't speak for evangelicals, but I know that things like abortion and transgenderism and socialism and feminism are all things that, from a left perspective, would cut against a lot of Christian social teachings. But again, everybody has to make that choice for themselves. I think if there's one thing you can say about Billy Graham and his involvement in politics, it's that he did feel like he got a little bit too close to it in the later years of his life. He was close personal friends with Nixon, felt like he kind of got burned by Nixon because of some of his public deceptions, and apparently told people towards the end of his life that he wished he had kept greater distance from politics. And I actually think that's one thing that the Catholic Church does pretty well, is that they don't, endorse candidates. They don't really get that involved in politics, besides providing voting guides on what the issues and policy positions of each candidate is. They don't tell you who to vote for, but they tell you to vote your conscience. And so they kind of, give you guidelines and ideas of what you should be thinking about when you go to the polls, but it's not this same sort of political movement that we've seen with some of the Southern Christian denominations.
Yeah, I think this election is definitely exposing that Christianity is not a monolith, that you have Christians who are looking at the part of the Bible that says you need to love your neighbor and you need to, give part of your material things to the poor and make sure everyone's whole. Looking at how Jesus lived his life as an example for, many Christians argue, for socialism. And then you have Christians who focus on other parts of the Bible and hold those parts of the Bible as interpreted in a different way from others, but as more important than some of the other teachings. And that's because, even those who follow a certain religion have different personal values and personal perspectives. And I think that's very interesting, because I think some people believe that they're in this sort of tribe, and these are my people, and of course they agree with me, and I trust their decisions. And seeing people make a decision that's different than the one this group to be making, it can be very unsettling to people, because I think at the end of the day, it's a part of our psychology as humans to be a little bit tribal. It's always how we've survived. It's how we became the dominant species on the planet, by working together and hunting together so that we can eat bigger game and eat meat. And many anthropologists believe that's why our brains are bigger, is because we have that protein. And so it's always been a part of us to have these tribes, and they were necessary for our survival. And I think it's a source of a lot of political fighting when people identify so closely with their politics. It can be kind of a sickness.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, tribes are also important, though, in giving people purpose and community and that aspect of the importance of human socialization. So there's trade-offs, of course. I would push back a little bit on the idea that because, Jesus gave food to people, that meant he was a socialist. I know that's sort of a conception that comes out sometimes about what the Bible says about that, but there's a lot of verses that make very clear that it's about personal charity, not taking other people's things and giving them through force. Even if we look at Ephesians, we have about the dignity of work. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands. In Thessalonians, for even when we are with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. In Exodus, if a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe, and it is stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is found, he shall pay double. Exodus again, you shall not steal. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey or anything that is your neighbor's. Proverbs, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. The list goes on, and I think it's important to point out that Christians and evangelicals and Catholics in particular give the most to charity every year in the United States. When you break it down on religious versus irreligious people, Christians give the most to charity. And so that's more consistent with biblical teaching to give your personal affects to charity than to use government force to take from somebody to give to somebody else, because it's not really keeping with God's teaching about helping others if you have to do it through government force.
Yeah, I hear about if you're willing to work and you want to work, you can work, you should work to earn a living for yourself. To me, that sounds like my pal Pavlina Chernova, who argues for a job guarantee. So like I said, yeah, people have different values, they interpret things differently. Very interesting to see this Graham-affiliated group. Very
not Graham-affiliated, really.
What's going to come of evangelicals for Kamala Harris? We've got more Rising after this.